We are honored to be joined by Congressman Jim McGovern. He represents Massachusetts' 2nd Congressional District in Central Mass, which includes many parts of Worcester County, where he's originally from. He earned both his bachelor's and master's degrees from American University, and while in college, worked as a congressional aide to U.S. Senator George McGovern, a 2-time presidential candidate for whom he campaigned for from 1981 to 1996. He was a senior staff member for U.S. Representative Joe Moakley, and since his election in 1996, Congressman McGovern has been widely recognized as an unrivaled supporter for social justice and fundamental human rights. He is currently serving his 10th term in Congress and serves as the 2nd-ranking Democrat on the House Rules Committee, a member of the House Agricultural Committee, and as co-chair of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. He has authored important legislation to increase Pell Grant funding to allow more students access to higher education, to provide funds to preserve open space in urban and suburban communities, and to give tax credits to employers who pay the salaries of their employees who are called up to active duty in the Guard and the Reserves. The Congressman is also a strong proponent of healthcare reform. His legislative efforts included reducing the cost of home health care and giving patients the dignity to be cared for in their own homes with the help of medical professionals. McGovern has also taken a leadership role in the fight against hunger at home and abroad, successfully expanding the McGovern-Dole International Food for Education and Child Nutrition Program, which helps alleviate child hunger and poverty by providing nutritious meals to children in schools in the world's poorest countries. A central focus of his career has been international human rights, which he has advocated for in countries such as El Salvador, Sudan, and Colombia. He's been a prominent voice against the Islamist government of Sudan for its prosecution of the war in Darfur, and LaSalle's Vice President Dean Hickey wanted to make sure I mentioned the Congressman had the privilege of sharing a jail cell with George Clooney after they were arrested for protesting the Bashir regime in Sudan. Hopefully the Congressman can give us some more details on that story after his presentation. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Congressman Jim McGovern.
Thank you. Thank you, Megan. Thank you. Well, first of all, Megan, thank you very much for the generous introduction. I can hardly wait to hear what I'm going to say after that build-up. And thank you for reminding everybody about my arrest. My parole officer made it possible for me to be with all of you today, so I want to thank him in advance. President Alexander, thank you very much for welcoming me here, I really like this place. And to all of you, some of you who are residents of LaSalle Village, this is what a remarkable place. And it just reminds all of us that learning is something that never ends. And we all could learn more, and we all need to learn more. And I wish some of the people who are running for president had that attitude, because listening to, I watched the Republican debate the other day, and I kind of felt like they all ought to go back to school. They didn't take science classes to realize there's such a thing as global warming. They ought to take history classes to understand why we got into some of the messes we've gotten into in the past. And they ought to go to a class to learn about politeness, too. You know, the other day, Donald Trump did something that I thought was impossible. He actually made me feel bad for Ted Cruz. He insulted him so much, I felt bad for Ted Cruz. It was brief, but you know, Megan mentioned that that I had worked for George McGovern, and he's one of my heroes, and we're not related. I was in New Hampshire campaigning for Hillary Clinton a couple of weeks ago, and they had me do a surrogate event, and as I was walking up to the podium, everybody kept on saying to me, I've always been a supporter of your father's. I've been a long-time supporter of your father's. And I told them, I said, well, thank you. My father owns a liquor store in Worcester, Massachusetts. I hope you'll keep on supporting him. But actually, I got introduced to politics when I was in junior high. And Mr. and Mrs. John Bloom are here. I went to Worcester Academy. When I first started there, he was a teacher, urban affairs and history. And I remember in 1972, we had a mock Democratic convention in Worcester Academy, and George McGovern won. And I remember I decided that I was going to, even at that young age, I was enthralled by, his platform of ending the war in Vietnam, of protecting the environment, of equal rights for everybody, feeding the world's hungry. All those things were very inspiring to me. And I remember I went out and I went to the local McGovern for President headquarters in Worcester, and I got leaflets and I passed them out. I put bumper stickers on people's cars. I was so, I wanted to make a difference. And on election night in 1972, when I was listening to my transistor radio, listening to the returns coming in, I was overjoyed that George McGovern had overwhelmingly won Massachusetts. I was a little bit more depressed when I learned he lost 49 other states. But that was the moment for me that clicked and said that politics is something important. And if you want to change things, whether it's locally or nationally or globally, you have to be involved. You have to care about who gets elected. Elections do matter. It does make a difference. And so I went on. When I went to college at American University, I needed a job, and I walked into George McGovern's Senate office. And I said, look, I'm looking for an internship. Is it possible that there's one available? And the chief of staff said to me, no, we're all filled. There's nothing here. And as I was walking out of his office, George McGovern walked in. I said, hi, I'm Jim McGovern, and I need a job. And so he invited me in his office, and we talked. And then we worked out a deal where I got a paid internship at a very minimal amount, but it was enough back then to kind of keep me alive. And it was one of the greatest experiences of my life. And we became very close friends, and I admired him very much. And like him, I consider myself a liberal, and I'm not ashamed to admit it to anybody. We remained the closest of friends. He continued to inspire me all throughout his life. Megan mentioned the McGovern-Dole School Feeding Program. That's a bill that I introduced named after George McGovern and Bob Dole. It's basically an international school feeding program. It says that we should try to help kids get into school, and one of the ways to do that is offering a meal. And in a lot of these poor countries, kids don't go to school because their parents would rather have them working in the farm or doing something else. But if you give a meal to the kid, then the parents will say, okay, well, that's one less expense for us, go to school. And especially with regard to girls. In a lot of countries where education for girls isn't a priority, this program has resulted in more and more girls going to school. And both George McGovern and Bob Dole, in a bipartisan way, understood the importance of, not only in terms of our moral obligation of feeding the world's hungry, but also understood that it's also in our national security interest to help those who are struggling in extreme poverty and who are struggling in hunger. And I have this kind of radical idea, and that is that when you do things that actually help people, then people like you. And if they like you, they don't want to blow you up. And I think the McGovern-Dole program, which has fed tens of millions of kids since Bill Clinton signed it into law back in 1999, has done more to help enhance our security than I think a lot of the military sales that we have completed all over the world and all the bombs we've been dropping. So I'm very, very, very proud of that. And I also had the honor of doing George McGovern's eulogy at his funeral, which he asked me to do. And it was a great, great honor. And I'll tell you, I wish there were more people like him. And not only people like him, but people like Barry Goldwater or Bob Dole. Not just Democrats like George McGovern, but even conservatives like them. actually, they all came to Washington to try to make a difference and to do something positive. They may have had different ways of getting there, but there was always this respect. And things have devolved. You know, you go back and read this political speeches of that 1972 campaign, or the 1964 campaign, and compare them to what is being said now on the campaign trail, which brings us kind of to the topic that I'm here to talk about, which is the whole kind of refugee issue and the immigration issue. Listening to these debates, I cringe. You know, my wife and I were saying the other day that we don't want our kids mimicking Donald Trump. We don't want them to behave like that. I mean, we raised our kids to say that everybody is important. No one's a loser. You know, no one's an idiot. Everybody has value. And yet, here's somebody who's leading in the polls, who's rising to the top by just hurling insults at people and offering no solutions. And not only hurling insults at people, driving wedges in our community in a way that I think is beneath what this country is about. And I'm really worried about that. You know, we had a debate a few months ago in Congress on a bill that basically, if it became law, would have ended the refugee resettlement program for all those coming from Syria and Iraq. Unfortunately, in the House of Representatives, we had this vote and it overwhelmingly passed. And not just Republicans, but a lot of Democrats. We even had a couple of Democrats from Massachusetts who voted for it. And I think the vote for it was more out of fear and more out of ignorance than it was based on facts and reality. You know, the principle of protecting refugees is a core component of this country's identity as a nation. And I don't ever want to lose that. You know, for people all over the world, you know, who are fleeing oppression or who are in the most desperate circumstances, the United States has always been there, for the most part. There have been exceptions in our history where we're behaving like we're behaving now. But basically, we're the only place people can turn to. And the refugees that we have accepted from countries all over the world over the years has enriched our country. We're a great country because of that, because of our diversity, because of the many traditions and values and, you know, and cultures that have come here. That's what makes us so special. And for someone to get up and basically make a blanket statement that we're going to block anybody coming from this country because of an irrational fear that everybody who comes from Syria is somehow a terrorist is crazy. It really is. And it should make all of us not only sad, but it should make us embarrassed and ashamed. And I think all of us have an obligation to push back. You know, as Megan mentioned, I went to American University. I had a history professor, Dr. Richard Brightman, who just wrote a book a few years ago, and on immigration during the period of the rise of Hitler in Germany. And one of the things that he wrote about was the fact that there was this hysteria in the 1930s in the United States, which basically put up a wall so that people, mostly Jews, who trying to come here, fleeing persecution, couldn't get in here because of all the hurdles. And there was all this paranoia that, oh, well, we don't know who's coming in here. We don't. Maybe they'll take our jobs, or maybe they're Nazi sympathizers are going to come in here, and all this kind of stuff. And it resulted in all these barriers that were put up to make it almost impossible for people to come here. He, in his book, talks about the family of Anne Frank, who on multiple occasions tried to come here, who had gone to, who had money, and to try to basically go and, to the U.S. embassies and say, hey, look, we want to immigrate to the United States, but was turned down all the time, unable to do it. And we all know the story of Anne Frank. Had we accepted the Frank family, she might be here, at 80-something years old, talking about her life story to all of you. But because of this kind of irrational paranoia on immigrants during that time, she and her family were refused entrance into this country. We know what happened to Japanese Americans, many of whom had sons fighting in World War II, fighting against the Imperial Japanese Army. And they were interned in camps, all because of this irrational paranoia. We look back on that now and we say we're ashamed. That was terrible. How could we have done that? What were we thinking? And here we are now, 2016, and it reminds me eerily of those days when I hear people talk about, refugees coming from the Middle East, in particular from Syria. Understand one thing. Refugees are the most desperate people in the world. These aren't people who are coming here to go to Disney World. These are people who have been in refugee camps for a long period of time. These are people who, many of them had very successful careers in Syria. Doctors, businessmen and women, teachers, scholars who fled because they wanted to protect their lives and lives of their families. And to come to the United States as a refugee, you have to jump through about 1 million hoops. It doesn't just happen. You go through all kinds of clearances and vetting, and the FBI has the final say, and Homeland Security oversees it. On and on and on. And for somebody who is a refugee who wants to come to the United States, by the way, it doesn't happen in a week or a month. It may take 2 years or even 3 years before you could be vetted enough to be qualified to come here. Most of the people who are coming here are widows and orphans. And to suggest that these people who have, who have fled this terrible violence are somehow dangerous to us, just ignores all the facts. But the facts don't seem to matter in this election year. When people say, well, look what happened in San Bernardino. I said, that was a terrible thing that happened in San Bernardino. But the man who did the shooting was born in Illinois. He wasn't a refugee that came from Syria. He was born in Illinois. I was, since 9/11, the United States has resettled over 75,000 refugees from all over the world. Of these, 2,034 have been from Syria. Out of the 23,000, that's out of 23,000, over 23,000 who applied for resettlement in the United States, only a little bit over 2,000 were resettled in the United States. So it's very difficult because we don't accept many people to begin with. But that is the total of Syrians who have been resettled in the United States. In the past 4 years, since the civil war in Syria broke out, the U.S. has resettled about 1,800 Syrian refugees in 130 communities across the United States. Massachusetts resettled 62 in Massachusetts, of which 24 were in the area of my hometown of Worcester. And none of these people, none, have ever been accused of terrorism. None have been accused of doing anything bad in the slightest possible way. In fact, they've all kind of come into our communities and enriched our communities. No one's complaining. There's no issue here. As one who I was in July, I actually went to. I obviously couldn't get into Syria, so I went to Turkey and went to a place called Gaziantep on the border of the Syrian-Turkish border, and met with a lot of the refugees who are not in camps but resettled within this city of Gaziantep. Young children suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome. Women who lost their husbands. People who are just in shock and not knowing what's going to happen next because they have no place to go. They're looking for help. And my view is that the world community, not just the United States, but the world community has an obligation to be there for people. This shouldn't be a big political, controversy. This is the right thing to do. And the people that I met with in Gaziantep were fleeing from all kinds of violence. The government of Syria was barrel bombing some of their towns. I mean, there's no normal life. Kids can't go to school. I mean, because of the bombing, they're learning in the basements of buildings. You got people fleeing from ISIS. You got people fleeing now because Russia's bombing every day. France is bombing every day. The United States is bombing every day. Everybody's bombing every day in Syria. There's no kind of safe space. And so what would you do if you were there? What would you do if you had kids, and loved ones? You'd want to get them to safety. And that's what this is. And that's what this is all about. And so, we need to understand that to turn our backs on these people, turns our back on the best traditions of this country. And I think turning our backs on these people plays into the enemies that we have around the world who believe that we have this phobia when it comes to people who are Muslim. And when Donald Trump talks about, no more Muslims in the United States, what he forgets to understand is that the majority of deaths as a result of ISIS have been Muslims. When he says we don't know, we can't trust these people coming in here because we don't know enough about their religion, well, read about it. It's a glorious religion. Read about it, this is, and we have had a vibrant Muslim community in the United States for as long as I can remember. And people, this tradition is something that we ought to embrace and celebrate. There is nothing violent about that religion at all. So why would we scapegoat, a religion? When you do that, again, you play into ISIS's hands, which say, look at the West has launched a war against Islam. And maybe that's what Donald Trump wants to do if he became president of the United States. But I think that would be a horrible thing to do. And not only against this incredible tradition and this incredible religion, but it would make us less secure. I would, let me just kind of conclude, and then we could talk about whatever you want to talk about here today. I've spent a lot of time with refugees, not only from the Middle East, but also from Central America. As was mentioned before, my first kind of official job after I left George McGovern was working for Joe Moakley of South Boston. And it was in the early 1980s. And at that time, there were a lot of wars going on in Central America. And a lot of Salvadorans in particular were coming into this country seeking refuge. And they were coming here because the violence was so terrible. And Joe Moakley did a local office hour meeting, and a group of people from Jamaica Plain came in with some Salvadoran refugees, and they told him their story about how they basically fled for their lives. If they had remained in El Salvador, or if they get deported back to El Salvador, they'd be killed. And so Moakley, again, he wasn't a foreign policy kind of guy. He used to joke that his idea of a foreign policy issue was driving from South Boston to the North End for an Italian sandwich. So he said, he called me up, he said, you should go to El Salvador and see if it's as bad as everybody says it is. Well, I said, I'm happy to do it, but is it, safe? He said, oh, you'll be fine. So I went to El Salvador and saw the terrible atrocities that were going on there. And I also talked to U.S. government officials at the time, Ronald Reagan was president, who didn't want to acknowledge that these people had anything to fear, because if they did, then they would have to admit that our policy of supporting the government down there was somehow flawed. And so meanwhile, all these people, were just looking for just some peace of mind. And so Moakley, this bread and butter South Boston politician, was so offended by our government not doing what he thought was the right thing to do that he passed a bill that suspended all the deportations. And things have changed down there somewhat. There was peace, but now there's more violence than ever. And we see a lot of children coming to our border. And a lot of people are saying, we can't take these children. Why are they coming to our border? Well, I went down to the Texas-U.S. border and met with some of these children. These are kids, some of them are so young that our Border Patrol people are taking collections to buy diapers for some of these kids. Parents who are so afraid that their kids are going to be targeted for death pay smugglers all the money they have in the world to take their kids to the U.S. border and drop them off. And you would think, based on the reaction by some in Congress, that was the end of the world. But the reality is that for these kids, if they don't get the refuge that they need here in the United States, they don't have a life. And yeah, we need to figure out how to get Central America on track. I would simply say that maybe instead of sending all kinds of guns, and maybe instead of just caring about drugs and immigration, maybe we ought to think about how we can help some of these countries deal with corruption and actually do development and become the countries they all could become, so people don't want to come here the way they have to do right now. But the deal is, we can't turn our backs on these people. And I guess my final thing I'd say to everybody here is that I think it's important for people like us, who may not necessarily know somebody who falls into this category of being a refugee or may not have a direct involvement. But I think it's important for us when we're meeting with our families and our friends, and there's always an uncle that will say something outrageous. I have a couple of uncles like that, and I usually just let it go. I don't let it go anymore, because what I've learned is when you let things go, then they get repeated and repeated and repeated, and they become fact. If we want to change our attitudes on immigration, and certainly with regard to how we deal with refugees, we need to push back a little bit. We need to correct the record. We need to tell people what the truth is. And I think if we do that, then you're going to see politicians parrot what they hear from their constituents. Because I got to tell you right now, you can't count on Washington to get it right on its own. I wish that were the case, but when it comes to the issue of immigration, everybody is nervous. Everybody is they don't know quite how to handle it. Notwithstanding the fact that we're a nation of immigrants, we all come from someplace, right? You never know it. And I think to bring some sanity back into this debate, we need people all over this country to start weighing in. And we need to fix our immigration laws. We need to have a comprehensive immigration reform. We need to get this right. And we need to do what I think everybody around the world expects us to do, and that is behave like a great nation. And I hope that we can do that. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to open this up to questions.